The pre-invasion intelligence assessment of Peleliu said the airfield was inactive, that the Japanese had abandoned it or reduced it to a secondary status that posed no meaningful air threat to the landing force scheduled to hit the beaches on September 15, 1944. The assessment was built on aerial photographs taken in the days before the mission, photographs that had shown a coral runway without aircraft, without the specific visual signatures of an operational airfield, without the evidence of the threat that intelligence had been tasked to find and had concluded was not there. The assessment was wrong. The photographs had been taken during the window when the Japanese were keeping their aircraft in dispersal areas and concealed positions, away from the runway and away from the cameras, and the window had closed 3 days before the landing when 40 Japanese aircraft, Zeros, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers, fully armed and fueled, were moved onto the field in the specific configuration of aircraft being prepared for operations rather than aircraft being stored. They were not there to defend Peleliu. They were there to attack the fleet. They were there for the moment when 28,000 Marines in landing craft would be crossing from their ships to the beach in the confined waters off Peleliu, packed into boats, exposed, unable to maneuver, presenting the specific kind of target that armed aircraft at low altitude over confined water can attack with devastating effectiveness. The men who positioned those aircraft understood exactly what they were doing and exactly when those aircraft would be needed. What they did not account for was one American pilot looking down on September 12th and making a decision that the intelligence failure made necessary and that the 8 minutes that followed made permanent. If you are new to this channel, subscribe now, because what Robert Stout did over Peleliu on September 12, 1944, is one of the most consequential individual acts of the entire Pacific War, performed by a man whose name almost no one knows. Major Robert "Cowboy" Stout flew from USS Hornet on the morning of September 12, 1944, with orders that defined both what he was supposed to do and what he was not. He was to photograph the Peleliu airfield, update the intelligence picture before the landing, confirm or revise the assessment that the field was inactive, bring back images that the planners could use in the final days of preparation. He was not to engage. He was to preserve his aircraft and himself for the intelligence value his mission would produce, the photographs that would be developed and analyzed and added to the picture of what the 1st Marine Division would face when it hit the beach on September 15th. His aircraft was an F-6F Hellcat, the Grumman fighter that had been specifically designed to defeat the Japanese Zero and that had done so with consistency throughout 1944, establishing American air superiority across the Central Pacific with the specific mechanical ruthlessness of a machine built for a purpose and fulfilling it. The Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 total rounds that Stout was not supposed to fire, that were standard armament rather than weapons of the specific mission, that would sit in the wings on the flight to Peleliu and on the flight back to Hornet while the cameras recorded what they were sent to record. Sergeant John Huff, Stout's crew chief, the man who knew the specific condition of his aircraft better than anyone else, had prepared the Hellcat for the mission with the thoroughness that pre-mission preparation required and had watched Stout climb in and launch with the composed attention of a man who understood that his work was in the preparation and that what happened in the air was beyond his reach from the deck of the carrier. Radioman 2nd Class Thomas Nakamura was at his station in Hornet's Communications Center when the transmissions from the Peleliu mission began arriving. Pre-mission radio silence gave way to the specific brevity of a combat pilot's transmission, information delivered in the compressed language of a man who is simultaneously flying, observing, calculating, and talking. He came on the radio and told us what he was seeing, Nakamura said in a post-war account. 40 aircraft on the field. Fueled. Ready. He had been trained to receive information and relay it without editorializing, to transmit the facts up the chain of command with the speed and accuracy that the chain required. He relayed Stout's first transmission to Lieutenant Commander Richard Upson in the Air Operations Center and waited for the next transmission. Lieutenant Commander Upson received the report and read it twice, the instinct of a man whose job requires him to process information before acting on it, checking that the words said what he thought they said. 40 aircraft on a field that intelligence had assessed as empty. He reached for the radio to discuss options with Stout, the operations officer's instinct to engage a pilot in a decision before the decision became irreversible. He was too late. By the time I had the radio operator try to raise him again, he was already in his first pass, Upson said in his post-war account. The transmission we received said he was attacking. There was nothing to do but wait. Nakamura listened to the radio with the specific focused attention of a man waiting for a transmission that would tell him what had happened to a pilot who had gone somewhere dangerous alone. The radio was quiet. He waited. He kept waiting. Stout's approach to the Peleliu airfield at altitude gave him the reconnaissance pilot's perspective, the elevated view that reveals patterns invisible from the ground, that shows the specific organization of what is below with the clarity that altitude and light and the absence of ground-level obstruction provides. He looked down at what intelligence had said was an empty field and counted. The discipline of the reconnaissance pilot, precise observation, accurate reporting, systematic accounting, produced a number that the assessment had not anticipated. 40 aircraft. Not one or two that might have been missed by earlier reconnaissance. 40, dispersed across the field in the specific pattern of aircraft being prepared for operations, not stored, not abandoned, ready. His calculation was the calculation of a man who has been trained to assess military significance, 40 armed and fueled aircraft, 3 days before a landing of 28,000 Marines, on an airfield that the planners believed was empty. The time required to return to Hornet, file his report, wait for a strike force to be assembled and briefed and launched and flown back to the target. Minimum 2 to 3 hours, likely more. In 2 to 3 hours, the Japanese could disperse those aircraft into revetments and covered positions where a strike force would find the field empty and the aircraft invisible. Dispersed aircraft survive. Aircraft on a runway at the moment of a strike do not. He had a runway full of aircraft. He had 6 guns and 2,400 rounds. He had 8 minutes, the time available before the anti-aircraft fire from the Japanese ground defenses found his aircraft with enough accuracy to end the mission for him. He pushed the nose of his Hellcat down. The dive began. Corporal Hiroshi Matsuda was in a revetment at the edge of Peleliu's airfield when the sound of Stout's diving Hellcat reached him, the specific engine note of an American aircraft in a steep dive. A sound that every Japanese soldier in the Pacific by September 1944 had been trained to recognize and respond to. He recognized it and he dove for cover, and from that cover he watched what followed with the involuntary attention of a man who cannot look away from something that is changing everything around him. The first pass came very fast, Matsuda said in a post-war account given after his capture late in the battle. Before the anti-aircraft guns could track it, the first aircraft caught fire immediately. The physics of what Stout's .50 caliber rounds did to a parked Zero were the physics of incendiary metal meeting unprotected fuel. The Japanese aircraft that had been Japan's war-winning weapon in 1941 had been built light, sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for the maneuverability that had made it lethal in the early years of the war, and the lightness that made it deadly in aerial combat made it fragile on the ground. A burst of .50 caliber fire into a Zero's fuel tank was not a contest. The first aircraft caught fire immediately. Then Stout pulled up. The anti-aircraft guns found his aircraft's flight path and began tracking. He reversed course. He dove again. The pilot was not stopping, Matsuda said. Each time we thought he had finished, he came back. The anti-aircraft guns were firing. They were hitting the aircraft. He kept coming back. The Japanese anti-aircraft defenses at Peleliu had been built to defend the airfield against exactly the kind of attack Stout was conducting, 13mm and 25mm guns positioned to cover the approaches to the runway, manned by crews who knew their fields of fire and who had been waiting for American aircraft to appear over the island since the pre-invasion strikes had begun. They were firing. The guns found the Hellcat on every pass, hitting the aircraft with the increasing accuracy of gunners who are tracking a target that keeps returning on predictable attack geometry, the dive angle and pull-up pattern of a strafing run being more predictable than any other form of low-altitude flight. Stout flew through the fire on every pass. He pulled up through the fire. He turned through the fire. He dove through the fire again. Technical Sergeant Harold Baumgartner would count the damage when the aircraft returned to Hornet, the holes in the airframe documenting each pass, each moment when the Japanese gunners found him and the Hellcat's armor and construction kept him flying. The plane came back with holes in it, Baumgartner said in a post-war account. You could see what he had flown through. We counted the damage and looked at each other. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then somebody said, "He went back in." Again and again he went back in. Aviation machinist's mate second-class Roy Chambers documented the damage in his maintenance inspection, the systematic assessment of what the Japanese anti-aircraft fire had done to an aircraft whose pilot had kept flying it through that fire 8 separate times because 8 separate passes were what 40 aircraft required and 40 aircraft were what the mission required. The 8 minutes over the Peleliu airfield were not 8 continuous minutes of sustained fire, they were 8 minutes of repeated cycles, each cycle a complete tactical action with its own geometry and its own moment of maximum danger. Dive from altitude. Acquire the target. Fire. Pull up through the anti-aircraft fire. Turn. Assess what remained. Dive again. The .50 caliber rounds from 6 guns at 400 rounds per gun gave Stout 2,400 total rounds to distribute across 40 aircraft, 60 rounds per aircraft if the distribution were perfectly even, which combat never makes even. His fire discipline was the fire discipline of a carrier aviation pilot whose training had been built around the specific scarcity of ammunition in extended combat, the knowledge that guns run dry, that every burst needs to produce a result, that accuracy is more valuable than volume when the volume is finite and the targets are not. He managed his ammunition across 8 minutes of attack runs against a field that was shooting at him with every available weapon, and when the last aircraft was burning, he had done what 2,400 rounds and 8 minutes and the specific trained courage of a man who kept going back could do. Private Masuido was watching from the Japanese infantry positions near the airfield, watching the smoke column that one American aircraft had produced in 8 minutes rise above the field that was supposed to be the instrument of his garrison's counterattack against the American landing. 40 aircraft, Ito said in his post-war account. 1 American. 8 minutes. I have thought about those 8 minutes for the rest of my life. Nakamura was still at his radio station when Stout's transmission came back through the static. He came on the radio and told us what he was seeing, Nakamura had said about the first transmission. The second transmission was different. The voice of a man reporting a completed action rather than an action in progress, the specific compression of a pilot who has done what needed doing and is now transmitting the result. The radio operator beside Nakamura wrote the transmission down and handed it to Upson. The number was 40. Upson read it and forwarded it to Mitcher's task force staff with the endorsement of a man who has processed something extraordinary and is transmitting it with the professional composure that the chain of command requires. Admiral Mitcher received it with the characteristic quiet of a man who had seen enough of the Pacific War to know what 40 aircraft destroyed in 8 minutes by one pilot represented, both as a tactical achievement and as the prevention of a catastrophe that the 28,000 Marines scheduled to land in 3 days would never be able to fully calculate because catastrophes prevented leave no record of their absence. He forwarded the recommendation for the Navy Cross with his endorsement. The endorsement traveled up the chain of command to Admiral Nimitz, who added his own and signed it. The Navy Cross that Robert Stout would receive was the institutional acknowledgement that the decision he had made alone at altitude over Peleliu on September 12 had been the right decision, the decision that the rules did not authorize and that the situation absolutely required. Like this video now, because in 3 days those 28,000 Marines are going to hit the beach, and what they find when they get there, and what they survive because of what Stout did, is the story that history has not told with the completeness it deserves. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa received the report of the American attack on his airfield through his communication system on September 12 and understood immediately what it meant for the defensive plan he had spent months building. Nakagawa was not an ordinary Japanese garrison commander. He was a tactician of genuine brilliance who had developed a new defensive doctrine specifically for Peleliu, abandoning the traditional Japanese beach defense in favor of a deep cave-in tunnel system in the island's coral ridges that would force the Americans to dig out each position individually at maximum cost. His plan had an air component. The 40 aircraft on the field were part of his overall defensive concept, timed to attack the American fleet and landing craft at the moment of maximum vulnerability on D-Day morning, adding an aerial dimension to the ground defense that would multiply American casualties beyond what his ground forces alone could produce. That component was now gone. He absorbed the report and responded with the professional adaptation of a commander whose plan has been partially destroyed and who must reconstitute with what remains. He accelerated the preparation of his ground defenses. He communicated to his garrison that the air support would not be available and that the ground defense would have to be complete in itself. He went back to his maps. He had lost 40 aircraft in 8 minutes. He still had 10,900 men in fortified positions that the Americans did not yet know the full extent of. The battle he was preparing to fight would last 73 days. The battle he had planned to fight, with Japanese aircraft attacking the landing force from above while his infantry held the ridges, was over before it began. Robert Stout had ended it on September 12. Matsuda emerged from his cover when Stout's final pass ended and looked at the field that had held 40 aircraft 8 minutes earlier. The blackened hulks of the Zeros and Vals and Kates were burning across the coral runway. The aircraft that had been positioned to attack American Marines in landing craft reduced to the specific visual evidence of what .50 caliber fire does to armed and fueled aircraft on an exposed runway. He looked at the smoke rising from the field and he looked at the sky where Stout's Hellcat was climbing away to the north, back to its carrier, back to the reporting chain that would process what had just happened, back to the deck where Baumgartner would count the holes and Chambers would document the damage and Whitfield would stand with the other pilots and listen to the debrief. "We watched the smoke rise from the airfield," Private Ito said from his infantry position. "We understood what it meant. Our aircraft were gone. We would fight alone." 3 days later, on the morning of September 15th, Corporal Eugene Sledge of the 5th Marines would climb down from his transport ship into a landing craft and cross toward a beach that Japanese aircraft would not attack, because one American pilot had made a decision at altitude 3 days earlier and had executed it in 8 minutes against an airfield that was supposed to be abandoned and was not. Sledge would document everything that killed his fellow Marines on September 15th with the precise, unflinching attention that made his memoir one of the finest accounts of Pacific combat ever written. He would not document Japanese air attack. There was none. Stout had made sure of that. Sledge did not know his name then. He learned it later. The 40 aircraft that were supposed to be above the beach on September 15th were ash on a coral runway. 1 pilot. 1 aircraft. 8 minutes. The Marines were coming. Stout brought his Hellcat back to Hornet on a flight path that the holes in his airframe documented with more precision than any written report could have managed, the physical record of 8 minutes over a Japanese airfield that had been shooting at him with everything it had while he kept diving through everything it had to finish what he had started. Lieutenant James Whitfield was on the flight deck when the aircraft came in and described the landing with the specific attention of a pilot who reads another pilot's aircraft the way a doctor reads a patient, the damage visible from a distance, the pattern of hits telling the story of what the flight had been before the pilot said a word about it. Stout taxied to his spot on the deck and the engine stopped and the canopy opened and he climbed out with the composed movement of a man for whom the extraordinary had been processed and filed and was now complete. He looked at the holes in his aircraft. He looked at the pilots and deck crew who had gathered with the specific gathering instinct of men who understand that something significant has just returned from somewhere dangerous. He was calm, Whitfield said in his post-war account. He looked at the holes in his aircraft and he looked at us and he said, 40. Just that. 40. Then he went to the debrief. The word moved through the carrier the way significant words move through ships, quickly, person to person, each transmission adding the specific weight of individual comprehension to a number that was still abstract to everyone who had not been over the airfield. 40. One pilot. One aircraft. 8 minutes. Technical Sergeant Harold Baumgartner and aviation machinists mate Roy Chambers worked through the damage assessment with the methodical attention of men whose job requires them to understand exactly what an aircraft has been through, counting holes, assessing structural integrity, documenting the specific pattern of hits that told the story of repeated attack runs through sustained anti-aircraft fire. Chambers looked at the damage and looked at his colleague, and neither man said anything for a moment. Then one of them said what both of them were thinking. He went back in. Again and again he went back in. Lieutenant Commander Upson conducted the debrief with the thoroughness that the significance of the mission required, working through Stout's account of the approach, the identification of the aircraft, the decision to attack, the sequence of attack runs, the ammunition management, the damage taken, the results confirmed. The debrief produced the formal documentation that the Navy Cross recommendation required, the official record of what Stout had seen, what he had decided, and what he had done about it, constructed from his own account and from the radio transmissions that Nakamura had recorded and from the damage assessment that Chambers had completed. Upson wrote the recommendation with the specific language of a man who understands that official documents are read by people who were not present and must be made to understand what presence would have made obvious. He described the intelligence context, the assessment that the field was empty, the 40 aircraft that the assessment had missed. He described the tactical calculation, the time required for a strike force, the likelihood that the aircraft would be dispersed in that time, the consequence of dispersal for the Marines landing in 3 days. He described the decision, one pilot, one aircraft, the alternative being no alternative at all. He described the execution, 8 minutes, 40 aircraft, 6 guns, 2,400 rounds, repeated passes through anti-aircraft fire, every aircraft burning. Commander Jackson Arnold reviewed the recommendation with the specific complexity of a commanding officer whose subordinate has violated his orders and produced a result that the orders were designed to prevent achieving in a different way. The orders had said photograph and return. Stout had attacked instead. The orders had been wrong for the situation. Stout had been right about the situation. Arnold endorsed the recommendation. Admiral Mitcher received the endorsed recommendation at Task Force 38 headquarters with the characteristic quiet of a man who had commanded carrier aviation long enough to recognize the difference between exceptional performance and extraordinary performance, between a pilot who executes a difficult mission well and a pilot who makes a correct decision in a situation that the mission parameters had not anticipated and could not have anticipated. Mitcher was one of the finest carrier aviation commanders in American history, a man who had been present at the birth of American naval aviation, who had commanded carriers in the Pacific from the beginning of the war, who had orchestrated the destruction of Japanese naval aviation in the Battle of the Philippine Sea 3 months earlier with the specific mastery of a commander whose understanding of air warfare was deeper than almost anyone else in the American military. He understood what Stout had done, and he understood what it had prevented, and he understood that the Navy Cross was the correct institutional response to both. He forwarded the recommendation to Nimitz's headquarters with his endorsement and returned to the operational demands of a task force that was still at war and had more work to do. The endorsement was one document among many that moved through his headquarters in the days before the Peleliu landing, but it was not a routine document, and the men who processed it understood that it was not routine, and the understanding moved through the task force staff the way understanding moves through organizations of professionals who recognize the rare thing when it appears in front of them. 3 days. That was the interval between what Stout had done on September 12th and what the 1st Marine Division would face on September 15th. 3 days in which 28,000 Marines prepared for a landing that every pre-invasion assessment had told them would be difficult but manageable, 4 days at most according to Major General Rupertus. A rough but fast fight according to the man whose job was to lead the division through it. Rupertus had commanded the 1st Marine Division since 1942. He had built the division's reputation through Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester into the finest amphibious assault force in the American military. He had also broken his ankle in a training accident before the landing and was preparing to command one of the most demanding battles of the Pacific War in physical pain that he managed with the specific stubbornness of a man who will not allow his body to determine what his mind has decided. His prediction of 4 days was not arrogance. It was the genuine assessment of an experienced commander whose intelligence picture did not yet reflect the full extent of what Nakagawa had built in the coral ridges of the Umurbergal Mountain. The intelligence picture showed the airfield, the beach defenses, the visible elements of the Japanese position. It did not show the cave networks, the interconnected tunnels, the mutually supporting firing positions that Nakagawa had constructed in the island's interior, the defensive system that would make Peleliu not a 4-day battle but a 73-day battle that consumed the 1st Marine Division's strength more completely than any previous operation in the division's history. What the intelligence picture correctly showed, after September 12th, was an airfield without aircraft. Stout had given the planners that correction. It was the correction that mattered most on September 15th. Sergeant David Tabor heard about the airfield attack before the landing, the information about Stout's mission having passed through the 1st Marine Division's communication network in the days between September 12th and September 15th with the speed that significant information travels through military formations before a battle. We heard before the landing that the Jap planes on the airfield had been taken out by a single Navy pilot, Tabor said in his post-war account. We didn't know his name then. We knew what he had done. The word went through the division before we landed. The word meant something specific to Marines who were 3 days from an amphibious assault. It meant one threat eliminated from a list of threats that remained long enough without it. It meant the landing craft would not be attacked from above while they were being attacked from the shore. It meant the beach would not have the additional dimension of Japanese aircraft at low altitude over men who had no cover and nowhere to go. Tabor described thinking about Stout when his landing craft hit the water on September 15th. The anonymous pilot whose name he did not know, whose decision at altitude 3 days earlier had removed a specific kind of death from the list of deaths available on the beach he was crossing toward. I thought about that pilot when we hit the beach, Tabor said. I thought, whatever is shooting at me right now, at least there are no planes. One man made sure there were no planes. I never knew his name until after the war. The landing craft moved toward the shore. The Japanese artillery opened up. The morning of September 15, 1944, began. Corporal Eugene Sledge climbed down from his transport ship into a landing craft at approximately 0800 on September 15 and crossed toward Peleliu with the 5th Marines, the regiment that would spend the first day of the battle advancing across the airfield that Stout had cleared of its aircraft 3 days earlier. His memoir, With the Old Breed, documents what the landing was with the precise, almost clinical attention of a man who processed combat through exact observation and preserved the observations across the decades until they became one of the finest accounts of Pacific fighting in American literature. He described the artillery falling on the landing craft as they crossed. He described the men dying before the beach was reached, killed in the boats, in the water, on the coral. He described the beach itself as a nightmare of smoke and fire and sound that compressed everything into the immediate demands of staying alive and moving forward. He did not describe Japanese aircraft attacking the landing force. He described every other form of Japanese fire with the precision that made his account definitive. Aircraft were not among the causes of death, he recorded, because aircraft were not among the causes of death available on September 15th. Stout had made sure of that. What Sledge documented, without knowing it was documentation, without understanding that the absence of air attack was itself a record of something, was the specific shape of a battle that had been altered before it began by one pilot's decision to dive rather than photograph and return. The beach that Sledge crossed was terrible. It was less terrible than it would have been. The 40 aircraft that should have been above it were ash on a runway 3 miles away. Captain George Hunt commanded K Company, 1st Marines, the company assigned to take the point, the coral promontory on the left flank of the landing beach that the Japanese had fortified with the specific thoroughness of men who understood that whoever held the point controlled the entire left flank of the American landing. His company landed at the left edge of the beach and turned toward the point and attacked it with the 235 men available to them against firing positions that covered every approach, machine guns and artillery and anti-tank guns in mutually supporting positions that required each one to be reduced individually before the position as a whole could be taken. His company suffered 157 casualties in the first day, killed and wounded in the assault on a position that the Japanese had built specifically to destroy the men attacking it. Hunt documented every weapon system the Japanese used against K Company on September 15th with the precision of a commander who was simultaneously fighting a battle and observing it with the professional attention that subsequent accounting required. He documented the machine guns. He documented the artillery. He documented the anti-tank guns firing at point-blank range. He documented the mortars. He did not document Japanese aircraft attacking his company from above while it was attacking the point from below, because Japanese aircraft were not above K Company on September 15th. They were burned metal on a runway. Those were supposed to be shooting at us today, Corporal Henry Lopez would say when his regiment crossed the airfield and he ran past the blackened hulks of the aircraft Stout had destroyed. Somebody got them first. Lopez did not know who. Hunt did not know who. The Marines of the 1st Division did not know who. They knew only that the specific threat that 40 armed aircraft would have represented was not present on the beach when they needed it not to be present. Colonel Louis Puller landed with his regiment on the most heavily defended sector of the Polilliu Beach, the left flank, where the Japanese defensive positions were concentrated and where the 1st Marines would suffer casualties so severe that the regiment would be relieved from combat after 4 days of fighting, having lost 1,749 men in 96 hours of the most intense close-quarters combat the Pacific War had produced. Puller was already the most decorated Marine in American history before Polilliu, a man whose career had been built around the specific kind of courage that does not calculate odds before acting and does not stop calculating solutions after acting. He commanded on September 15th with a broken ankle that he had suffered before the landing and that he managed the way he managed everything that threatened to limit what he could do, by ignoring it. His after-action assessment of the landing described the Japanese defensive preparation as the most formidable he had encountered in his career. He described the beach defenses, the interlocking fire, the specific intelligence failures that had left the division unprepared for the extent of what Nakagawa had built. He received the update before the landing that the aircraft on the airfield had been destroyed by a single Navy pilot. His response, recorded by his aide, was 4 words: good. One less thing. The 4 words were not dismissal of what Stout had done. They were the cognitive economy of a combat commander processing a long list of threats in the days before a battle, acknowledging the removal of one item from that list and moving to the next. One less thing. The list was still long. The battle would prove how long. But one item had been removed from it by a pilot whose name Puller did not record in that moment and did not need to record because the operational fact was what mattered and the operational fact was confirmed. The aircraft were gone. Nakagawa conducted his defense of Polilliu from inside the cave system he had built in the Umurbergal mountain, issuing orders by telephone and messenger, maintaining the cohesion of a defense that the Americans could not see and could not predict, receiving reports of American advances and directing responses from positions that American artillery and air power could damage but not destroy because the coral caves absorbed punishment that would have obliterated conventional fortifications. He received the daily reports of American advances and American casualties with the specific composure of a commander whose defensive plan was working exactly as designed in every dimension except the one that Stout had removed on September 12th. His ground forces were performing as he had trained them to perform, holding the cave positions, inflicting casualties, forcing the Americans to pay the maximum price for every yard of advance. His air component was not performing because it did not exist. The 40 aircraft that should have attacked the American fleet on September 15 had been destroyed 3 days earlier by a single American pilot who had looked down and made a calculation and acted on it. The battle Nakagawa was fighting was the battle he had designed minus its air dimension, more difficult without that dimension, requiring his ground forces to absorb the entire weight of the American assault without the relief that 40 aircraft attacking the fleet would have provided. He continued the defense. He would continue it for 73 days. He would commit suicide when his force was reduced to a few dozen men rather than surrender, sending his final message that his force had destroyed its colors and was making a final attack, receiving a posthumous promotion of 2 ranks from a government that honored the defense even in defeat. The defense was extraordinary. It would have been more extraordinary still if Stout had brought back photographs instead of burning 40 aircraft. Nakagawa knew that. He fought with what he had. Private First Class Arthur Jackson landed with the 7th Marines and performed on September 18, 3 days after the landing, one of the extraordinary individual acts of valor that Paliliu produced in quantity sufficient to award 4 medals of honor to Marines of the 1st Division. He attacked 12 Japanese pillboxes alone, destroyed all 12, killed approximately 50 Japanese soldiers, and survived. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He survived to perform that action because he survived the landing on September 15. He survived the landing on September 15 because the beach on that morning did not include Japanese aircraft attacking the landing force from above, because Stout had been over the airfield on September 12 and had made a decision that removed that threat from the beach where Jackson landed. The chain of causation is not clean. War never produces clean chains of causation, never allows the historian to say with certainty that this specific man lived because that specific man did that specific thing. But the chain is real. The military historians who calculated that Stout's attack saved between 500 and 1,000 Marine lives on D-Day were working from the specific mathematics of 40 armed aircraft attacking a landing force in confined waters and calculating the casualties that attack would have produced. Those casualties were not produced. The men who would have been among them lived instead, lived to fight through the 73 days of Paliliu, lived to perform the Medal of Honor actions that the battle produced, lived to come home or to die in the coral ridges of the Umurbergal for reasons that had nothing to do with Japanese aircraft because the Japanese aircraft were gone. Like this video now. Because the story of what those Marines went through in the 73 days after the landing Stout made survivable is the story that explains why what he did on September 12 mattered as much as the historians calculated it mattered. The battle that the 1st Marine Division fought after the landing that Stout had made survivable was not the battle that Major General Rupertus had predicted, not the rough but fast fight of 4 days that his pre-invasion assessment had described with the confidence of a commander whose intelligence picture had not shown him what Nakagawa had built in the coral ridges of the Umurbergal mountain. The Marines who crossed the beach on September 15 and survived the landing that 40 Japanese aircraft would have made catastrophic walked into a battle that their training and their experience and their genuine courage had not fully prepared them for, not because those things were insufficient but because Nakagawa's defensive system was unlike anything the American military had encountered in the Pacific War. The caves were not caves in the ordinary sense. They were engineered positions cut into coral that absorbed artillery and aerial bombardment without being destroyed, connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to shift between positions faster than American forces could track the movement, each position covering the others so that attacking one meant being fired on by 2 more. The Marines attacked this system with the tools available to them: flamethrowers, demolition charges, direct fire from tanks and artillery, the specific brutal intimacy of close-quarters fighting in confined spaces, and they paid for every yard of advance with casualties that accumulated across 73 days into one of the highest casualty rates of any American amphibious operation in the Pacific War. What they did not pay, on the morning of September 15, was the additional cost that 40 Japanese aircraft attacking the landing force would have imposed before the battle for the ridges even began. That cost had been paid in advance by one pilot on September 12. The receipt was a Navy Cross and a burning airfield and 2,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition expended in 8 minutes of repeated passes through fire that had put holes in his aircraft and had not put him in the water. Corporal Eugene Sledge moved through the battle for the Umerbergal with the 5th Marines through September and into October, advancing yard by yard through a landscape that the fighting had made into something that resisted every adjective he later applied to it in his memoir because the adjectives were inadequate to the reality. He described the smell of the place, the coral dust, the tropical heat, the specific smell of combat in a confined space over an extended period that no description fully captures and that no one who experienced it forgot. He described the men dying around him, not in the abstract but specifically, by name, with the particular detail of the wounds and the circumstances that the precision of his memory preserved and that the writing of his memoir decades later transmitted to readers who had not been there. He described the psychological weight of extended combat in terrain that offered no relief and no perspective, the cave positions that had to be taken one at a time, each one a separate action against defenders who intended to die in place and mostly did. He described all of this without ever describing Japanese aircraft attacking his position from above, because the aircraft that should have been above the beach on September 15th and above the Umerbergal in the days that followed were not there. Stout had ensured they were not there. The battle that Sledge documented in With the Old Breed was terrible in every dimension that he recorded. It was less terrible in one dimension that he could not record because it did not happen. The absence is the documentation. The silence in his account where Japanese aircraft would have appeared is the record of what September 12th had produced. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines were relieved from combat on September 19th, 4 days after the landing, the regiment having suffered 1,749 casualties in those 4 days and having been reduced to a combat effectiveness that the battle's remaining requirements exceeded. The relief was the specific institutional acknowledgement that a formation had been used to the limit of what could be asked of it and that asking more would produce diminishing military returns at escalating human cost. Puller accepted the relief with the specific anger of a man who does not accept limits easily and who experienced the withdrawal of his regiment as a defeat that his own casualties had imposed on him. Not a defeat by the Japanese, but a defeat by arithmetic, the arithmetic of men available against positions remaining, a calculation whose result he could not argue with though the argumentative impulse was genuine and strong. His regiment had taken the point. It had pushed through the beach defenses. It had advanced into the ridges far enough to understand what the ridges were going to cost. It had done these things at a price that left it unable to continue. The Marines who had not been killed or wounded on September 15th had been killed or wounded in the 4 days that followed. The landing that Stout had made survivable giving way to the ridge fighting that nothing could make less costly because the coral caves absorbed everything that American firepower delivered and gave back fire from positions that could not be seen until the men attacking them were close enough to be killed by them. Puller's 4 words, "Good, one less thing," had acknowledged the removal of the air threat from the list of what his regiment would face. The list had remained long enough without it. His regiment had worked through the list until the list had worked through his regiment. Private First Class Sterling Mace crossed the Peleliu airfield with the 5th Marines on September 15th and saw the blackened remains of the Japanese aircraft that Stout had destroyed 3 days earlier, the burned hulks still on the runway where they had been when the .50 caliber rounds had ignited them, the specific visual evidence of an action that none of the Marines crossing the field that morning had witnessed but all of them were benefiting from. His memoir, Battleground Pacific, documents the Peleliu experience with the same ground-level precision that Sledge's account provides, the 2 memoirs together constituting the most complete enlisted documentation of what the 1st Marine Division went through in the 73 days of the battle. Mace described crossing the airfield under Japanese fire from the ridges, running across open coral with no cover, the Japanese guns on the Umerbergal having clear fields of fire across the runway that the Marines had to cross to advance. He ran past the burned aircraft without stopping, the tactical situation on the airfield not permitting stopping, The Japanese fire from the ridges, making every second of exposure on the open runway a second that should be spent moving toward the far side rather than examining what had already been destroyed. He understood what the burned aircraft represented when he had time to think about it later. "Those were supposed to be above us," he wrote in his memoir. "Someone made sure they weren't." He did not know who had made sure. He learned after the war. When he learned the name, he said what everyone who learned the name and understood what it meant said, that the history books had not given the man his due, that the battle that everyone remembered had been shaped before it began by an action that almost no one remembered, that the name Robert Stout deserved to be as known as the name of every general and admiral whose decisions shaped the Poliliu campaign. Nakagawa sent his final message from inside the cave system of the Ymerbergal on November 24, 1944, 70 days after the landing, that his air component had been supposed to contest and had not contested because Stout had destroyed his aircraft 3 days before the landing. The message reported that his force had destroyed its colors, the regimental flags, burned to prevent their capture, and was making a final attack with the survivors of a garrison that had begun with 10,900 men and had been reduced to a few dozen. He had conducted one of the most remarkable defensive actions of the Pacific War, holding a fortified position against the full weight of the American military for 73 days, inflicting casualties at a rate that made Poliliu one of the most costly American amphibious operations of the war, demonstrating a defensive doctrine that the Japanese military would study and apply in subsequent island battles, including Iwo Jima. He did all of this with his ground forces alone, without the air component that his plan had included and that Stout had eliminated on September 12. The calculation of what his defense would have looked like with 40 aircraft attacking the landing force on September 15 is the calculation that military historians performed when they assessed Stout's impact, and the result of that calculation, the 500 to 1,000 additional casualties that 40 aircraft would have inflicted on a landing force that was already absorbing 1,111 casualties on D-Day, represents the specific human cost that Nakagawa was denied by one pilot's decision at altitude. 3 days before the battle began, Nakagawa committed suicide in the cave with whatever ceremony the circumstances permitted. He was posthumously promoted 2 ranks. The defense he conducted was extraordinary and it was incomplete, and the incompleteness was Robert Stout's work. The Navy Cross that Stout received was the second highest American military decoration, below only the Medal of Honor, above every other recognition the Navy could confer. The citation described his action in the specific formal language that military citations use to describe things that formal language cannot fully describe. The observation of 40 aircraft on a field intelligence had assessed as empty, the decision to attack rather than return and report, the execution of the attack under fire, the result of 40 aircraft destroyed. It did not describe the 8 minutes in the way that the men on the deck of Hornet described them, did not describe Stout climbing out of a bullet-riddled aircraft and saying one word to the men around him. It did not describe Nakamura at the radio listening to the silence and then hearing the transmission that said it was done. It did not describe Baumgartner counting the holes and looking at his colleague and neither of them saying anything for a moment. Military citations describe actions. They do not describe the human texture of actions, the specific quality of courage that is not dramatic in the moment but is precise and sustained and repeated, the courage of a man who pulls up through anti-aircraft fire and turns and dives back through it again because the aircraft on the runway have not all been destroyed yet and the mission requires that they all be destroyed. The Navy Cross described the action correctly. It did not describe the man. The man was described by the people who were there, by Whitfield who watched him climb out and say 40 and walk to the debrief, by Carlson who said nobody was surprised because that was cowboy, by Chambers who counted the holes and understood what they represented. Ensign David Carlson said that nobody was surprised, that the pilots who knew Stout had heard what he had done and had understood it immediately as the action of a man whose character they had observed across the missions they had flown together and whose decision over Poliliu was consistent with everything they knew about him. That was cowboy, Carlson said. He saw what needed doing and he did it. He didn't need someone to tell him. He never did. The nickname that Stout had carried through his naval aviation career was not the nickname of a man who performed for an audience. It was the nickname of a man whose style was direct and whose judgment was trusted and whose decisions under pressure reflected the specific integration of training and character that combat aviation produces in the men who survive long enough to be tested by it. He had been tested on September 12 in the specific way that the Pacific War tested pilots, alone, above a target that was shooting at him, with a decision to make that no regulation anticipated and no superior could make for him because the time required to ask and receive an answer was the time in which the decision became irrelevant. He made the decision. He executed it across 8 minutes of repeated passes through anti-aircraft fire. He returned to the carrier and reported the result in one word and walked to his debrief. He received the Navy Cross and continued flying combat missions from Hornet and survived the war. He said about disobeying his orders what a man says when he has thought about a decision long enough that the thinking has produced clarity rather than doubt. "I saw planes that needed destroying," Stout said. "So I destroyed them." The statement deserves to be examined with the seriousness it contains beneath its apparent simplicity, because what Stout was describing was not recklessness or disregard for military authority but the specific form of military judgment that distinguishes commanders from executors, that separates the men who can be trusted with authority in ambiguous situations from the men who require complete instructions before they can act. He had been given instructions that did not anticipate the situation he found. He had assessed the situation with the tools his training and experience provided, calculated the threat, calculated the options, calculated the consequences of each option, and had acted on the assessment rather than on the instructions, because the assessment told him that the instructions were wrong for the situation and that the situation was more important than the instructions. This is not a principle that military authority can endorse without qualification. The military institution requires obedience to function, and obedience cannot be conditional on each soldier's individual assessment of whether the orders make sense without undermining the chain of command that makes large-scale coordinated military action possible. But it is a principle that military history consistently validates in the exceptional cases, the cases where a man's judgment was right and the orders were wrong and the consequences of following the orders rather than the judgment would have been catastrophic. Stout's case is among the clearest of those exceptional cases. His orders were wrong for the situation. His judgment was right. Between 500 and 1,000 Marines lived because his judgment was right. The Navy Cross was the institution's acknowledgement that in this case, on this day, the judgment had been right and deserved to be honored rather than disciplined. Corporal Matsuda was captured late in the battle, one of the 202 Japanese prisoners taken in a battle that produced 10,695 Japanese dead, the specific ratio of prisoners to dead reflecting the specific nature of Nakagawa's defensive doctrine and the specific nature of the men who implemented it. In his captivity, he gave the account that described Stout's attack from the Japanese ground crew's perspective, the sound of the diving aircraft, the first pass that the anti-aircraft guns could not track in time, the fires that began immediately, and then the pilot coming back. Again and again, the pilot coming back. Matsuda's account is the Japanese documentation of what the American record documents from the other direction. The same 8 minutes seen from the ground below rather than the cockpit above, the same 40 aircraft seen burning from the revetment rather than from the attack run, the same single American pilot assessed from the perspective of the men whose aircraft he was destroying. 40 aircraft, Matsuda said. 1 American. 8 minutes. I have thought about those 8 minutes for the rest of my life. The statement is the most precise assessment of what happened over Peleliu on September 12, 1944, that any participant produced, more precise than the Navy Cross citation, more precise than the military historian's calculations of lives saved, because it reduces what happened to its essential elements without elaboration or institutional language. 1 American. 8 minutes. 40 aircraft. A Japanese ground crewman who had watched it happen from a revetment on the edge of the field spent the rest of his life thinking about it. The Marines who landed 3 days later and did not die from Japanese air attack on the beach spent the rest of their lives not knowing about it, or knowing only what Tabor had heard and what Lopez had seen when he ran past the burned hulks on the runway. The story of Robert Stout and September 12, 1944 asks questions that history has not asked with sufficient seriousness because history has not told the story with sufficient completeness. What does it mean that a decision made by one pilot in 8 minutes over a Pacific Island airfield determined whether between 500 and 1,000 men lived or died on a beach 3 days later? What does it mean that the men whose lives were shaped by that decision, the Marines who landed on September 15th and crossed the airfield and fought through the Immerbergal and came home or died in the Coral, mostly did not know who had made it or what it had cost to make it? What does it mean that the Navy awarded Stout the Navy Cross and that the Navy Cross is the correct recognition and that it is simultaneously true that the Navy Cross and the recognition it represents have not been sufficient to place his name in the account of Peleliu where it belongs? The Battle of Peleliu is remembered for Rupertus's wrong prediction and Puller's casualties and Sledge's memoir and the coral ridges that consumed the 1st Marine Division across 73 days of fighting that military historians have debated ever since as either necessary or unnecessary, as justified or unjustifiable, as the price of securing MacArthur's flank or the price of a strategic error that cost 6,500 Americans their lives or their health for an island that subsequent events rendered less important than the planners had believed. All of those debates are real and all of those questions are legitimate and none of them include the name of the pilot who made the landing that started the battle survivable in the specific sense that 500 to 1,000 men survived it who would not have survived it if he had followed his orders and taken his photographs and returned to the carrier. Robert Stout followed his judgment instead of his orders. His judgment was right. The Marines landed. Some of them lived who would not have lived. He said he saw planes that needed destroying so he destroyed them. Sometimes the story of a war comes down to one man, one aircraft, 8 minutes, and the specific courage to go back in again when the first pass is done and the aircraft on the field have not all been burning long enough. Commanders and key figures involved in this historic event, for educational purposes. Major Robert Cowboy Stout, F-6F Hellcat pilot, USS Hornet, CV-12. Admiral Mark Pete Mitcher, Commander, Task Force 38. Admiral William Commander, 3rd Fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Fleet. Major General William Rupertus, Commanding General, 1st Marine Division. Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, Commander, 1st Marines. Colonel Harold Bucky Harris, Commander, 5th Marines. Colonel Herman Hannikin, Commander, 7th Marines. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, Commander, Japanese Garrison, Peleliu. Lieutenant General Sadi Inoue, Commander, 14th Division. Commander Jackson Arnold, Commanding Officer, Fighter Squadron, USS Hornet. Lieutenant Commander Richard Upson, Air Operations Officer, USS Hornet. Ensign David Carlson, Stout's wingman. Lieutenant James Whitfield, USS Hornet Fighter Squadron. Technical Sergeant Harold Baumgartner, USS Hornet Deck Crew. Aviation Machinists Mate 2nd Class Roy Chambers, USS Hornet. Radioman 2nd Class Thomas Nakamura, USS Hornet. Corporal Eugene Sledge, 5th Marines. Private 1st Class Sterling Mace, 5th Marines. Captain George Hunt, K Company, 1st Marines. Corporal Henry Lopez, 5th Marines. Sergeant David Tabor, 1st Marine Division. Corporal Hiroshi Matsuda, Japanese Airfield Ground Crew. Private Masaru Ito, Japanese Infantry, Peleliu Garrison. Time, September 1944. Dates, Stout's attack on Peleliu Airfield, September 12, 1944 Marine D-Day landing. September 15, 1944 Battle of Peleliu ends, November 27, 1944. Locations: Peleliu Island, Palau Islands, Western Pacific USS Hornet, CV-12. Task Force 38's Peleliu Airfield, Immerbergal Mountain, Bloody Nose Ridge. Weather: Western Pacific tropical conditions. Intense heat, humidity, Coral dust during the battle. Units involved: USS Hornet, CV-12, Task Force 38, 1st Marine Division, 5th Marines, 1st Marines, 7th Marines, Japanese 14th Division, Peleliu Garrison.